Good morning. This is Environmental Intelligence episode 26 for April 21st, 2026, your daily environmental intelligence briefing. Here's what changed overnight in the environmental regulatory landscape. British Columbia's new all-electric passenger ferry reduces underwater noise but increases collision potential for humpback whales, requiring updated marine risk assessments. A Colombian rights of nature defender received the Goldman Prize for blocking fracking along the Magdalena River, with implications for how Canadian practitioners frame indigenous and ecological protections in regulatory submissions. Engineered biochar research advances carbon capture and resource recovery techniques relevant to contaminated sites remediation. Professionals should review project-specific marine mammal mitigation plans and track cross-border policy influence on nature-based remediation approaches this week. British Columbia's new all-electric passenger ferry has commenced operations, directly engaging the federal Fisheries Act and Species at-Risk Act requirements for humpback whale protection. While the vessel eliminates underwater noise pollution that previously masked whale vocalizations and disrupted foraging, it introduces a higher strike risk because its quieter propulsion reduces detection distance for cetaceans compared with conventional diesel ferries. 3 humpback whale deaths from vessel strikes were recorded in British Columbia waters in the period leading up to deployment. This has prompted marine mammal experts to recommend revised speed restrictions, routing adjustments, and real-time monitoring protocols. For consultants and proponents involved in coastal infrastructure or port expansions, this means current environmental assessments and Fisheries Act authorizations must now quantify both acoustic and physical strike hazards. Updated collision probability models are now required rather than noise thresholds alone. Practitioners should incorporate vessel strike risk matrices into upcoming permit applications and consider deploying acoustic or visual deterrent systems where ferry routes intersect critical whale habitat. Watch for Transport Canada or Fisheries and Oceans Canada guidance on electric vessel mitigation standards expected in the coming months. What this signals is a shift in how we balance emissions reductions against physical interaction risks in marine infrastructure projects. In practice, it means your next coastal environmental assessment will need to expand the hazard analysis beyond traditional underwater noise modeling. Yuvelis Morales Blanco won the Goldman Prize for successfully defending Colombia's Magdalena River from fracking using rights of nature legal arguments. The effort prevented industrial expansion that had caused repeated oil spills, killing thousands of animals and displacing residents. Canadian practitioners supporting projects near Indigenous territories or navigable waters should note the precedent for framing ecological entities in regulatory submissions. This applies under the Impact Assessment Act and Federal Fisheries Act. Early integration of rights of nature language in engagement plans can reduce litigation risk on cross-jurisdictional files. Environmental groups have filed suit to block BP's Casquita project in the deep Gulf of Mexico. They argue that a blowout could exceed Deepwater Horizon impacts despite the company's post-2010 safety upgrades. While outside Canadian jurisdiction, the litigation underscores heightened scrutiny of deepwater risk assessments. This may influence National Energy Board and Impact Assessment Act reviews for future Canadian offshore or transboundary proposals. Consultants preparing similar applications should stress test spill trajectory models against worst-case scenarios under current CEPA and Fisheries Act standards. Wild salmon exposed to environmental cocaine concentrations exhibit increased wanderlust behavior. This alters normal migration and site fidelity patterns in the first field study of pharmaceutical impacts on free-ranging fish. The behavioral change has direct implications for Canadian risk assessments under the British Columbia CSR and CCME aquatic guidelines. Contaminant-driven movement could expand exposure pathways beyond traditional plume boundaries at former industrial or wastewater sites. Laboratories running fish tissue analyses should consider adding behavioral endpoints to ecological risk assessments for sites with complex organic contaminant mixtures. Recent advances in engineered biochar demonstrate improved capacity for simultaneous carbon capture and resource recovery. This offers a dual-purpose amendment for contaminated soil and sediment remediation. Practitioners can evaluate its deployment at sites regulated under Alberta EPEA or Ontario OREG 153/04, where both risk reduction and greenhouse gas offsets are required. The technology bridges laboratory efficacy data with industrial scalability. It potentially lowers long-term monitoring costs compared with pump-and-treat or permeable reactive barriers. What I find interesting here is how this aligns carbon sequestration goals directly with traditional risk-based remediation. Vietnam will extend its special consumption tax cut for electric vehicles until the end of 2030. The move aims to accelerate fleet turnover and emissions reductions. Canadian mining and remediation firms with international supply chains should track parallel policy shifts. These could affect demand for battery minerals sourced from jurisdictions with overlapping CEPA import controls. The 4-year extension provides longer-term market certainty for consultants advising on ESG compliance for cross-border clients. More than 1 million German renters now generate electricity via plug-in balcony solar systems. These balcony craftwork units require no permits, electricians, or landlord approval. The model offers a low-barrier template for Canadian multi-unit residential remediation projects where rooftop access is restricted. It could simplify on-site renewable offsets under provincial net zero building requirements. Practitioners should evaluate similar modular systems for temporary power at remote contaminated sites. This would reduce diesel generator runtime and associated air quality compliance obligations. If you are working on British Columbia coastal projects involving new or quieter vessels, review current marine mammal mitigation plans and update strike risk sections before next Fisheries and Oceans Canada submission. Incorporate behavioral toxicology considerations into ongoing ecological risk assessments for aquatic sites with potential pharmaceutical or complex organic loading. Evaluate engineered biochar as a dual carbon capture and risk reduction amendment for active or planned remediation programs under EPEA or O Reg 153/04. Brief international mining clients on extended electric vehicle policy signals that may shift battery mineral demand and associated ESG reporting obligations. Update wildfire interface emergency response templates to include overnight fire behavior modeling using current climate ensembles. April 22 through 28 brings an ongoing public comment period for several provincial environmental assessment amendments. Check respective ministry registries for exact closing dates. April 25th marks the expected release window for updated Federal Species at Risk Act recovery documents relevant to marine mammals. April 30th is the internal deadline for many British Columbia CSR Schedule 2 sites to finalize annual compliance reporting packages. May 15th is the CCME Working Group target for revised guidance on climate-resilient contaminated sites risk assessment. Now, speaking of changing climate conditions and their effect on contaminant behavior, here's something worth carrying into your next interface project. You land at a northern British Columbia interface subdivision 2 days after a wildfire slept through the night, but reignited at 2 meters, jumping the control line and destroying 3 homes. The incident commander's report notes that overnight relative humidity failed to recover above 35%. That is exactly the threshold where Canadian Forest Fire Weather Index system predictions begin to diverge from observed fire behavior. Under historic climate normals, forests experience roughly 550 fewer fire-friendly hours per year in many western provinces. Current projections show those hours increasing, compressing the safe suppression window and altering liability calculations for both private consultants and provincial wildfire agencies. When preparing pre-disturbance risk assessments for oil and gas or mining clients near the wildland-urban interface, experienced practitioners now run fire weather index scenarios through downscaled climate ensembles rather than relying on 30-year normals. Then overlay those outputs on contaminant transport models because fire-induced soil hydrophobicity can mobilize previously stable hydrocarbons or metals. The nuance most juniors miss is that nocturnal fire spread is no longer an anomaly, but the new baseline in many jurisdictions. This requires updated emergency response plans that integrate real-time fuel moisture probes instead of solely depending on distant weather stations. The most common mistake is submitting a wildfire mitigation plan based on daytime-only burn windows. The fix is to require overnight fire behavior modeling using at least 2 independent climate projections and to explicitly address liability allocation for after-dark escape routes in the final report. Before we wrap, watch for the Federal Species at Risk Act recovery documents expected later this week. That's environmental intelligence for today. If this briefing is useful to your practice, share it with a colleague and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We're back tomorrow. Have a productive day. This podcast is curated by Patrick, but generated using AI voice synthesis of my voice using ElevenLabs. The primary reason to do this is I unfortunately don't have the time to be consistent with generating all the content and wanted to focus on creating consistent and regular episodes for all the themes that I enjoy and I hope others do as well.